Well, hello, this is Greg Mertz, and I'll be presenting a program called Shiloh, A Dozen Decisions. I'm going to be looking at 10 decisions that I think had an important impact on the battle, one decision that um, had an impact on the way in which we used to understand the battle, a decision that was once considered to be very important. And then I'm going to include one other decision that I just consider very unusual and very bizarre that could have had an important consequence, but fortunately was reversed before the battle and ended up not being a big factor at all. I'll take a little bit of look at some of the circumstances leading up to each of the decisions, discuss the decision itself, and then a little bit about the consequences. So, our very first decision that we will embark upon was made by Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and it is his reaction to some of the failures in the Confederates' Western theater in the 2 months prior to the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh was fought on April 6th and 7th of 1862, and we will begin our timing, if you will, just 2 months before on February 6th. But central to this decision, as well as many of the other decisions we're going to be looking at, is the Confederate commander, General Albert Sidney Johnston. And very important to appreciate about him is that he is very close to President Jefferson Davis. They both attended West Point together for 2 years. Um, Johnston's last 2 years were the same as Davis's first 2 years. Jefferson Davis was also a Secretary of War at a time when some very important things happened in Johnston's career. The Second United States Cavalry was formed at that time, and in that elite unit, Johnston was made the colonel, while Robert E. Lee was made the lieutenant colonel, second in command of that regiment. At the time of the Civil War, when the first five full Confederate generals were named, Albert Sidney Johnston is the highest ranking Confederate field commander. Only Samuel Cooper, the adjutant general with a desk job in Richmond throughout the war, was ranked higher. And Albert Sidney Johnston's assignment was called Department Number Two, which stretched from the Allegheny Mountains in the east to the Indian Territory in the west. Very importantly, one of the things that was done in this department and many of the others early in the war is that the type of strategy used was called a cordon defense, where sizable numbers of troops were stationed at a relatively large number of important points. So for Albert Sidney Johnston's department, his cordon defense is going to be predominantly along the Tennessee and Kentucky border. He would have had troops um, out in Arkansas, for example. The next important point here on the Mississippi River is Columbus, Kentucky. As we work our way continuing to the east, the next important point of the cordon defense along the Tennessee River is Fort Henry in Tennessee. Along the Cumberland River, Fort Donelson in Tennessee. And as we continue to the east, there are troops in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and that is where Albert Sidney Johnston himself will be. It is along a rail line that runs down to Nashville. So think of Bowling Green as defense of the state capital of Nashville. And then over off our map to the right, to the east, will be some troops stationed near the Cumberland Gap. The area of action that we want to start with is Fort Henry on February 6th of 1862. Again, exactly 1 month before the Battle of Shiloh gets underway. And Albert Sidney Johnston's initial reaction when Fort Henry fell to Ulysses S. Grant and his Union Army, as well as support of some Union Navy forces, Johnston's original reaction was that this whole line should fall back further to the south. However, Johnston soon kind of changed his mind, because instead of advancing directly from Fort Henry south, going upstream on the Tennessee River, Grant did not want to leave a sizable force sitting in his rear at nearby Fort Donelson. So Albert Sidney Johnston then thinks of reinforcing Donelson. He feels that because at Fort Donelson, the Cumberland River continues on down to the capital of it, Nashville, which is the area where he would need to retreat from up here at Bowling Green. So Johnston decided, well, let's see if Fort Donelson can hold on long enough to give Johnston a chance to pull back from Bowling Green to Nashville. And early in the fight at Fort Donelson, things actually went quite well for the Confederacy. They repulsed a Union Navy attack on February 14th, but eventually the forces surrendered on February 16th. And Johnston now realizes that he has to abandon this entire line as he had originally thought he should. Now, the Tennessee delegation is very upset that Albert Sidney Johnston has lost most of the state of Tennessee so early in the war. The spokesperson for the congressional delegation at Richmond is this man, Confederate Senator Gustavus Adolphus Henry Sr. He also knows Jefferson Davis fairly well because they were classmates together in law school. Interestingly, this is the Henry for whom Fort Henry was named. And part of the message sent to Jefferson Davis is that the delegation felt that Davis ought to relieve Johnston of command, making the comment that he is no general. Well, Jefferson Davis's response to them was that if Johnston is not a general, we had better give up the war, for we have no general. So his confidence in Johnston is not shaken. And his first key decision is not just to retain Johnston, but the problem, as I guess Davis saw it, is in that cordon defense, having troops spread out all over. And so the cordon defense is going to be abandoned. The consequence of that is that the Confederates can now establish a standing army, and they will consolidate all of the troops that we had just looked at that remain in Johnston's command down here near the lower portion of the map at Corinth, Mississippi. The only exception to that is going to be the troops in Arkansas under Van Dorn. He is indeed supposed to come to Corinth, but as we will see, he will not make it in time for the Battle of Shiloh. But all the rest of Johnston's men concentrate at Corinth, Mississippi, but they'll also draw troops for some other departments, including troops coming up from Pensacola, Florida, and from Louisiana. So all in all, there is going to be an army of about 44,000 Confederates formed in Corinth, Mississippi, poised to strike the Union Army whenever there is an opportunity. For our next decision, we are going to look at Ulysses S. Grant's boss, Henry Halleck, who's a department commander, commands what is called the Department of Missouri. And this is a decision that I consider to be a petty, self-serving decision made by Halleck. Halleck not only has designs not only on commanding his own department, but he realizes that the department just to the east of him, under Don Carlos Buell, is one that he would like to have under his control as well. And as we shall see, his goal will be to take the armies in both of those departments and merge them for what would be a fight in the area of hopefully Corinth, Mississippi, and we will see that instead the Battle of Shiloh will come along before Halleck has a chance to uh, execute his plans. But under Halleck again is Ulysses S. Grant, who has really accomplished a great deal at this point of the war. By capturing those two forts, he also gains an important sobriquet when addressing the Confederate high command at Fort Donelson, says that he will only accept an unconditional surrender, which of course matches his nicknames of U.S. Grant. And in the aftermath of that, because of the fact that Fort Donelson is on the Cumberland and leads to Nashville, Grant himself goes over to meet with Don Carlos Buell, that Army Department commander. So perhaps one of the things that is going through Halleck's mind is that he uh, will not need to be in command of two departments if Grant and Buell can work effectively with each other. So I think there's probably a little bit of jealousy at this particular point. So Halleck will start to accuse Grant of doing a variety of different things, such as claiming that Grant took his troops into a territory of another department. And because Halleck is working with the War Department to encourage them to merge the two departments, Halleck is being asked to supply various information, and he needs some responses from Grant. And he writes to Grant at one point saying, "Why do you not obey my orders to report strength and position of your command?" And in reality, what's happened is that Grant has responded to Halleck's request via telegraph, but there's a telegraph operator sitting in Cairo, Illinois, who is sympathetic to the Confederate cause and is not forwarding Grant's messages on to Halleck. And of course, neither Grant nor Halleck will be aware of that at this particular time. So Halleck continues to get annoyed with Grant and eventually makes the decision to take Lincoln's most successful general and relieve him over these disputes, which are basically administrative matters. While Grant is relieved of command on March 4th, the person that will be in charge is General Charles F. Smith. And as we shall see, one of the issues with Smith that relates to one of our other upcoming decisions is that he is bedridden during much of his tenure of command. He was transferring from a skiff to a riverboat and slipped and badly scraped up his leg. The leg got infected, and the infection was so bad it would eventually take Smith's life a few days after the Battle of Shiloh. But important to appreciate that Smith is bedridden during most of his tenure. Well, Lincoln will eventually have to get involved with this and makes demand from Halleck either give some evidence of Grant's wrongdoing and prefer some charges against him, or reinstate him to command. So fortunately, this first decision does not last terribly long, but I still can't help but wonder what some of the potential consequences would have been. So Grant is out of command for 13 days. He will be back in command for 20 days before the Battle of Shiloh. But if this thing had lingered on longer, there was potential that the Battle of Shiloh could have been fought with Grant confined at Fort Donelson, basically under house arrest, and Smith unable to get out of bed and go to the battlefield. I also can't help but wonder how this might affect Grant and his initiative, which is one of Grant's, I think, greatest qualities, and also his communications with Halleck, going back and forth, knowing just how touchy Halleck is. So those two decisions. Leading on to the third decision, was won by William Tecumseh Sherman, and his decision on just how he will deal with reports that the Confederate Army is on the outskirts of the federal camps. Now, just a little backtrack where we left off back with the Confederate Army. They are gathered around Corinth, Mississippi, looking for an opportunity. And Confederates do learn that um, Buell's army is nearing Grant's army and a merger is about to occur. So one of the things that the Confederates would like to do is attack Grant before Buell arrives and then deal with Buell in the aftermath of that. So as we'll see, for a couple of days before the Battle of Shiloh, Confederates are closing in and forming up on the outskirts of the Federal camps. Now, it's also important to know a little bit about Sherman and what he had done earlier before this Shiloh campaign, but he once held the Department of the Ohio, the same department that Don Carlos Buell is commanding during the Shiloh campaign. And while he was there, he seemed to see danger all around him. And he, at one point, indicated that he needed 200,000 men to properly defend his department. And it is, I think, widely believed that Sherman had a nervous breakdown and eventually resigned his department. And his next assignment will be at a camp of instruction in St. Louis, where Halleck had his headquarters as his Department of Missouri uh, uh, command. And Halleck decided to use Sherman in some of their discussions of strategy and was impressed with him. So when it came time for the two more new divisions to be formed and assigned to Ulysses S. Grant, it was Halleck that made sure that one of those two new divisions went to Sherman. And as he reports to the Army, while there are 6 divisions that would be in Grant's Army at Shiloh, Sherman is the only West Point educated division commander. So while Smith is injured and unable to get out and about, he is going to rely very heavily on input for Sherman, including where the Army would camp. Now, here in this map, right in this area, is Pittsburg Landing, an alternate name for the Battle of Shiloh on the Tennessee River. And Sherman will realize that the Pittsburg Landing is a good landing and that the ground nearby is very good for a campsite, in part because there are some nearby creeks that would protect the flank. Owl Creek, shown through here, protects the Union right. And while much of the Union left is protected by the Tennessee River, the rest is protected by this stream called Lick Creek, which flows into the Tennessee just off of the map to the right. Also of minor interest at that time, but would be very important at the time of the battle, the front of the command is slightly protected by 2 streams, one called Shiloh Branch right through here, and another called Locust Grove Branch, which runs into Lick Creek. They provide a nominal amount of protection along the front, but do also notice here there is a gap between those 2 creeks, and we'll talk a little bit later on about decisions made by the general, or excuse me, the colonel, placed in command right at that particular spot. So, based on advice from William T. Sherman, the Army will set up camp here. Sherman himself will set up his division right here behind Shiloh Branch. The other brand new Green Division is commanded by Benjamin Prentiss. He will be setting up here, partly in the gap, but some of his men slightly protected by the Locust Grove Branch. And then 3 other divisions that will camp at Shiloh. Interestingly, the most experienced ones are setting further to the rear. And all of these forces are under orders from Halleck not to bring on a general engagement until Grant's army and Buell's army can unite. So, how does Sherman react to these reports on the days just before the battle of Confederate forces outside of the Union camps? Well, here's just one example, and there are others that we could cite. But one of the regiments on the outskirts of Sherman's camp is the 53rd Ohio, under the command of a man named Jesse Appler. And on the very day before the battle, Appler finds Confederates approaching his camp. He has the long roll played, so his men fall into position in front of their camp. He's confident that on this day before the battle, that once Sherman learns the enemy's outside of his camp, that Appler's men are going to be sent in some kind of action. But when Sherman is informed and Appler or the messenger returns, he announces to all the men, Colonel Appler, General Sherman says, take your damn regiment to Ohio. There's no enemy nearer than Corinth. And there are other similar reactions that Sherman has had. So the decision he makes of how to deal with these reports of the enemy outside of his camp is to report to Grant on the day before the battle, I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position. What are the factors that affect Sherman's assessment? Well, it might be because earlier on, as a department commander, he overestimated Confederate threats. And it may also be out of appreciation for Halleck, who doesn't want a battle to take place yet, for allowing Sherman to have a command. But for perhaps those two things combined led Sherman to overcompensate by minimizing the Confederate threat at Shiloh. And so, as Grant reports to Halleck on that same day before the battle, he will say, I have scarcely the faintest idea of an attack, a general one, upon us, but will be prepared should such a thing take place. And of course, this report, as well as Sherman's earlier report, would eventually prove to be exceedingly embarrassing. The consequences of the decision to ignore basically the Confederates on the outskirts, there will be no defensive works built. There will be no increase of reconnaissance patrols, at least ordered by Sherman, and there will be no strengthening of the pickets. The next decision that we will take a look at is a decision made by Johnston regarding some internal opposition to making this attack. Here's a map showing how the Confederates were poised on the eve of the battle. Here is Sherman's command around Shiloh Church on the outskirts of the army. Here is Prentiss's command that we looked at from some earlier maps. And down here in the lower left-hand corner are the Confederates forming up to make their attack. So they're poised to attack, but it's taken a lot of time for the Confederates to get into position. They actually had hoped to make the attack earlier than they did. But as they're forming up, also, it's important to know the Confederates have not been quiet. These are green troops that don't realize the importance of trying to conceal themselves. There had been some rain on the march. Some Confederates even fired their guns while they're waiting in line, because they are unsure whether their weapons are going to work because of the rain. And the skirmishing has occurred over 2 days before the Battle of Shiloh. So the Confederates have as their second in command G.T. Beauregard, and as they're waiting on the night before the battle, Beauregard argues that they should abandoned the plans to make the attack, saying now they will be entrenched to the eyes. Well, Johnston joins in this discussion. He listens to them, but does not engage in a counter argument. He is apparently fairly quiet in this meeting. And one of the things that he will state is, we shall attack them at daylight tomorrow. Shortly after that meeting with Beauregard and some of his corps commanders breaks up, Johnston goes to his staff that evening. The staff are going to be loyal to their army commander. They frequently during a battle are asked to speak on his behalf. So it seems that rather than try to convince subordinates of the need to fight, he's going to make sure his staff understands what he wants to do in his plan. He said, I would fight them if they were a million. It's something that is often quoted, but the most important part of that is what comes next. They can present no greater front between these two creeks than we can. And the more men they crowd in there, the worse we can make it for them. Now, what are the two creeks he's talking about? Two of the ones that we were just discussing as reasons why Sherman laid out the attack there. Again, Owl Creek is over here on this side. That would be the most important one for Johnston's plans, while Owl Creek prevents any Confederates from the outside from getting in at the Union camp. But what if the Confederates can break through in this gap and get through some of these mild streams on the front? And so if Confederates can get inside of this, they can use Owl Creek as a trap. Johnston's battle plan is shown here in this particular map. And I want to stress that this is his plan. This is not what actually took place. We know that Johnston would like to form up his troops and have the forces on the right make a big sweep so that the whole army can push the Union forces up into this area and pin them against Owl Creek. All these dotted blocks here are to show broken Union troops trapped against Owl Creek. The next morning, the morning of April 6th, as Johnston goes to the front, again in the presence of Beauregard and some of his subordinates, Beauregard once again voices his opposition to making the attack, feeling that surely the Federal Army is prepared and waiting for them. As they're talking, the first shots of the battle are heard, and Johnston proclaims, the battle has opened, gentlemen. It is too late to change our dispositions. Tonight, we will water our horses in the Tennessee River. So Johnston's decision is to reject the calls to abandon the campaign and to proceed with the attack. The consequences of this, Johnston's assessment of the Federal preparedness proves to be correct. He has got scouts out, and the scouts have been reporting to him. They see no evidence that the Union Army has reacted, and no evidence to support, the kind of things that Beauregard is declaring. And the Confederate attack on the Union position is largely a surprise attack. And we'll delve more into that to what degree it is a surprise attack in our next decision here. There's a decision that is going to be made by a colonel by the name of Everett Peabody. He's a Harvard graduate and is one of the few people in these two outlying brigades that has any combat experience. He has fought in the little-known Battle of Lexington, Missouri in September of 1861. But he's going to have to make a decision of what to do when you question the intelligence that is provided to you by your superiors. And his superior happens to be Benjamin Prentiss. So he's uneasy about the reports that have been handed down to him. And Peabody is sitting right here in between Shiloh Branch off to his right and in between Locust Grove Branch off to his left. He is the one full brigade on the outskirts that does not have any protection from either Shiloh Branch or Locust Grove Branch. And his division commander, Benjamin Prentiss, is also like Sherman, stressing that they should not bring on an engagement. And he somewhat, again, like Sherman, is rationalizing that these reports of Confederates outside of his camp are nothing to be concerned about. But whatever Peabody decides to do is in the pre-dawn of April 6th, the day of the battle, to send out a reconnoitering party toward the Confederates. Now, here's a map that in part shows the reconnoitering party, but here's where Peabody's men would be located. Their camps would be basically right above that line, and when they will eventually fall into a battle line here. But the reconnoitering party went from the area of the camps down in this direction, and here I know we got a whole lot that we try to show on this one map, but this row of black dots through here is a skirmish line that of the reconnoitering party sent out by Peabody, and right in front of him are some Confederate skirmishers. After about an hour of skirmishing, with the reconnoitering party given instructions, don't just find a skirmish line, but if you find skirmishers, I want you to figure out what's behind them. But after an hour of fighting, the Confederate skirmishers fall back and they meld into the battle line. The next thing Peabody's reconnoitering party knows is here comes a solid battle line toward them, and some of them crossing through what's called Woods Field here so that they can actually be visible. So now the reconnoitering party has learned what Peabody wants to know about what's behind the skirmishers, and they fall back, spreading the word that the Confederates are attacking. As the Confederate assault begins, Benjamin Prentiss is furious at Peabody, feeling he has brought on the battle that Halleck does not want. Says, Colonel Peabody, I hold you personally responsible for bringing on this engagement. And Peabody proclaims back, General Prentiss, I am personally responsible for all my official acts. The consequence of Peabody's reconnoitering party is that the Union Army receives some advance warning of the Confederate attack. Some of the myths of Shiloh is that Union soldiers are shot in their tents while sleeping. That is not the case, except for maybe some men on sick leave or something. But every able-bodied man sets up a battle line in front of his camp at the Battle of Shiloh, in large part due to Peabody's reconnoitering party. Peabody would be killed in the Battle of Shiloh. This monument here to the right with an upright cannon and four stacks of cannonballs around them is what you'll find everywhere a brigade commander or higher is killed in the Battle of Shiloh. But Prentiss would refuse to give Peabody any credit for providing a warning for the rest of the Army. And it's really been in more recent years that Peabody's contribution to the Battle of Shiloh have been fully appreciated. So the next decision again is one made by Albert Sidney Johnston, and we'll see also by some of the Corps commanders as well, of how to deal with the problems of command and control. Command and control basically being how much of a battle line can any commander actually see and understand what's happening and be in position to make adjustments and reactions during the combat. Beauregard, as the second in command, was given the assignment to organize the troops, but he did not organize them the way that Johnston had intended. Here is a map that we looked at before of Johnston's battle plan. One of the things that Johnston had communicated to Jefferson Davis that he's going to take his largest of the four corps under Bragg, put them here on the right. Hardee, his corps in the middle, and Polk on the left. Each of these men would have roughly a third of the battle line to direct. And as we discussed with the plan, Bragg on the right with the largest corps, given the key assignment, the big sweeping movement to try to pin the Union Army against Owl Creek and to force them to surrender. So that again was the plan for the organization as well as the fight. Here is how Beauregard organized the corps. He put Hardee in front, Bragg second in regular line of battle, and then took Polk and Breckinridge, both stacked up in columns behind as reserves, stacked up in columns so they could go basically wherever they were most needed. What this means is that each corps commander at the front, Hardee and Bragg, and as we'll see, the same would hold true for Pope, would end up needing to try to control basically the entire front of the battle line. And another big problem with this is there's no Confederate officer that is in charge of the Confederate right and that sweeping movement to try to turn the Union left. What will eventually happen in the battle, as the last bullet point here, is as Hardee's, Bragg's, and Polk's men all become intermingled, the corps commander is going to decide among themselves that they're going to control by different sectors. So Hardee will take the left, Polk the center, and Bragg the right. That is not to show where their specific corps ended up on the field. That's to show where the corps commanders ended up taking control of a sector. And for Johnston, he of course also had to decide just what is his role going to be as the Army commander. So let's look at some of the factors that went into this. First, Beauregard, as second in command, is not in favor of fighting this battle. He wants to go back to Corinth. And as we also mentioned a moment ago, there's no senior officer to direct the Confederate right, the key to the success of the battle plan. And as we also looked again, the corps commanders are going to merge. So to what degree, even if Johnston gives orders to corps commanders, do they have control over any of their troops that's in their immediate sector? A lot of problems with command and control due to the way Beauregard lined up his troops and with Beauregard's point of view of how this battle should be fought. So the next decision, Johnston decides to go to the front and specifically the right front so that he can direct the key movement. Beauregard is going to be sent to the rear to direct the reinforcements to the front. And many will be critical of Johnston because he seems to abdicate Army command. But as I think we will see, that some of the consequences are that he ends up being at the critical point and executing the flank movement, particularly when new information about the federal position arrives. So now let's take a look at the situation once the battle gets underway. It's now around 9 o'clock in the morning. Albert Sidney Johnston is down here in this particular sector and will witness his Confederates pushing Prentiss out of his command, out of his position. And one of the things that will happen next is that some of these Confederates are now going to turn to the left to strike Sherman in his flank and also McClernand, who's coming up to help Sherman. And at that particular moment, Johnston gets word that there are more Union troops further on off to the east, here where you can see Stuart. That is a lone brigade. It gets reported to him that it's a division, but but Johnston is here in Prentiss's camp at this particular moment. He makes a decision to have the troops that are already moving to attack Sherman and McClernand to continue. but he recalls any of the troops that are not yet engaged and also calls on Breckinridge, his very last corps, to move on over here to join in the assault on the Union left flank. There is no time that is lost. If Johnston was further to the rear and a courier had to try to deliver that and explain not only that Stuart was further on off beyond the Confederate right flank, or trying to explain what is going on with Prentiss driven from his camp and other troops moving against Sherman and McClernand. He's there at the point to know what's happening and can very easily alter the battle plan to make sure that the Federal left is turned, as was the key part of his plan. So with that, this is the same map we just looked at, but now appreciating that the Confederates are over here. They will attack Stuart, and Stuart's men are going to be driven out. With that, all Union troops that were along this first of the three Union positions have been driven back. So Sherman is falling back, McClernand, Prentiss, and Stuart. And when Johnston sees that Stuart is falling back, he proclaims that checkmates them. The next task is to move on to the second Union line. I'll refer to it as the Hornet's Nest line. Right in front of Johnston is a Union division commanded by Hurlbut. Beside him are the remnants of Prentiss, a division commander named W.H.L. Wallace, and then some of McClernand's and Sherman's men, as they fall back, will loosely tie into this Hornet's Nest position. But Johnston now wants to take his reserve under Breckinridge and send them against Hurlbut. But Breckinridge reports that his men will not budge. Breckinridge is a man who was the vice president of the United States just before the Civil War. He's a man that has been a major in the Mexican War, but he arrived in Mexico after all the fighting had ended. So he's basically a political general with very little experience and has green troops under him. And here we got this critical moment when his reserves are needed to strike the flank of the second line, and again, his men won't budge. So Johnston turns to Breckinridge and said, "Then I will help you. We can get them to make the charge." So Johnston makes a decision that it's at this critical moment, he needs to lead the troops himself. And I find it interestingly, he's going to include Breckinridge in this. Notice his pronoun was not "I will do it." It's like "we will do it." So he includes Breckinridge to rally the troops. And what is done, Johnston there on the right, you may notice here in his hand, he's holding a tin cup. There's actually a story behind that. But he goes to Breckinridge's men, rides up and down the line, tapping their bayonets with that tin cup, and said, referring to the bayonet, "These men must do the work. Men of Missouri and Arkansas, the enemy is stubborn. I want you to show General Beauregard and General Bragg what you can do with your bayonets and toothpicks, with toothpicks being the Bowie knife." The consequence, this attack is successful. And I think another consequence is that Breckinridge will develop into a fine general. Most of my knowledge of him is from in the Shenandoah Valley, and I think he does a good job here. How much of that attributed to his work with Johnston on the first day of Shiloh is tough to know. But one of the other consequences of this, of Johnston appearing at the front, is that he will be killed in the battle. You recognize this as another mortuary monument, and he's going to deprive the Confederacy of the services of what may have been one of the best soldiers that they had in the Confederate service. Next in line, I should say, Hurlbut is going to be driven from his position. Beside him again is Benjamin Prentiss. And we're going to look at a decision that he made that was long thought to be very influential in the battle, and definitely affected our early understanding of it, but a decision that is not as important as we once thought it was. So, Hurlbut, here's a look at that second line once Hurlbut withdrew. So, Hurlbut had been right here in the vicinity of this peach orchard before these two brigades of Statham and Bowen drove him out after Johnston rallied the troops. But further on down here is Prentiss, and beyond him, oh, it's not labeled as such as W.H.L. Wallace. Beyond that is where Sherman and McClernand had been. But you'll notice that not only with Hurlbut gone, but with Sherman and McClernand gone, the Confederates are starting to curl around the flanks of Prentiss and Wallace. Now, Prentiss and Wallace could likely have withdrawn just as Hurlbut and McClernand and Sherman had to the third and final federal position of the day. But um, one of the things that Ulysses S. Grant had ordered his men to do is to hold on to their positions at all hazards. He was expecting one of his divisions that was further to the north to join him on the first day of the battle. He also knew that Buell was closing in. So Grant spends the first day of the battle trading space for time, and again ordered his men to hold their positions at all hazards. We've heard of such orders being given on many battlefields, but exactly what does that mean? Well, Prentiss would say, I was in constant communication with Generals Hurlbut and Wallace during the day, and both of them were aware of the importance of holding our position until night. I have no idea where Prentiss got the idea that holding at all hazards meant to hold until night, but when the fighting took place in the center of the hornet's nest, Prentiss, in his, I guess, attempt to hold on till night, continued fighting until he is absolutely surrounded and he is captured along with 2,200 of his men. The consequences of that decision, well, Prentiss would claim, and it was believed for a long time, that his sacrifice bought Grant time to establish his last line. But it's apparent that the key elements of that were really already in place, that Prentiss could have joined Grant's last line if he had withdrawn a little bit earlier, and that one of the other consequences is that we tended to place a greater importance on that sacrifice in the hornet's nest than is probably deserved. The last line that was held by the Union Army is shown here, with Sherman on the right, McClernand in the center, and Hurlbut on the left, the troops that were on either side of the Hornet's Nest. Hornet's Nest is just off the kind of the bottom of your map here. But this would be Grant's final position. Beauregard had to make a decision now that he is in command of the army following Johnston's death, of whether or not he's going to attack this third position. Some of the factors to look at and reasons why one might not attack that. The Confederates are extremely fatigued, and I'm sure they're hungry. They're getting low on ammunition. With Breckinridge committed to attack Hurlbut, that means that now all of the fresh reserves have been committed, and that Union position is very, very strong. It's got a lot of artillery, it's got gunboats, and it's got favorable terrain. So let's look at that map that we just looked at one more time. Notice here all of the artillery pieces that are shown augmenting this portion of the line. You'll also notice Pittsburg Landing is right here on the flank of the Federals. The gunboats Tyler and Lexington are here, and they can particularly fire up Dill Branch, this ravine here of any of these Confederate troops that might launch an attack, and some of them, by the way, did against Hurlbut and McClernand's positions. We'll take a look at Dill Branch a little bit later, but that is a very substantial terrain feature. But Beauregard did not attack Grant's last line, not for the reasons we just looked at, but for this message that he sent to Jefferson Davis at the end of the first day of the battle. He said, "We this morning attacked the enemy, and after a severe battle of 10 hours, thanks be to the Almighty, gained a complete victory." Beauregard believes there's a complete victory that just needs to be mopped up the next day. So he's calling off the action, will regroup his men to finish off the Union Army on April 7th. So his reason for halting again is not because of the condition of the army or the strength of the Union position, but because he thinks that the battle is basically won and is a foregone conclusion. The consequence, as Tim Smith, who's written the definitive book on Shiloh, said, Beauregard makes the right decision, but for the wrong reasons. And this is the most controversial decision of the entire battle, led to a series of what ifs regarding what would Johnston have done if he had lived, and would he have succeeded in attacking that line. The Confederate monument at Shiloh is a criticism of Beauregard's decision. It's shown here that the lady in the middle is the Confederacy surrendering the laurel of victory to death, which took their army commander Johnston, and night, which brought Beauregard. But Johnston makes another decision that's influenced by that Federal gunboat fire. The Tyler and Lexington, besides being stationed here to fire up Dill Branch, would spend the night of April 6th and 7th firing shells into what would be the battlefield. They each do so for half the night, firing periodically. And it's those gunboats that apparently played heavily on Beauregard's next decision. So not only did he decide not to attack the last line, but he decided to withdraw his troops from their advanced positions. He said he issued orders to withdraw the troops from under fire of the Federal gunboats and to sleep on their arms. The consequence, Beauregard pulls back to the Federal camps. He gave up ground that he acquired at high cost on April 6th. And while he can't know it at this point, the day of May 7th is going to be a day in which Beauregard finds himself on the defensive, and he's going to end up abandoning some very strong defensive terrain. We looked at this map before quite some time ago, but we talked about Owl Creek on this side of the battlefield and Lick Creek on that side. We talked a little bit about Shiloh Branch and Locust Grove on the front, but let's look in the middle. You'll see that there's kind of an hourglass shown here. We were discussing Dill Branch. There's also Tillman Branch. If the Confederates hold their advanced positions and stay south of Tillman Branch and south of Dill Branch and west of Tillman Branch, they can deliver a crossfire on the Union Army inside, and also crossfire on the road that runs in what's described here as the Shiloh Divide. The main road running from Pittsburg Landing to Corinth runs right through here, and Confederates can make it very difficult for the Union Army to utilize that if they had not withdrawn. Here is Dill Branch. The Confederate advanced position, they ended their day on April 7th on the top of this hill. So the Union Army might have been forced on the second day of the battle on moving from your right across Dill Branch and trying to climb up this steep hill with Confederates at the top. But again, that was not to be due to that decision made by Beauregard. And our last of the dozen decisions is what Grant decides to do with his back up against Pittsburg Landing. Um, this is not only Grant's last line because it is the last position they would hold during the day, but because of the where Pittsburg Landing is situated, is the last one that he can realistically hold at all without giving up the area that he's expecting reinforcements. And even on this map, you can see the lead element of Buell has arrived and is being ferried across. And two of his regiments will be slightly engaged at the end of the first day of the battle. But this is critical for Grant to hold this spot if he's going to retain Pittsburg Landing. But many around Grant thought that by holding on Grant's last line, that gave him the opportunity to retreat. Don Carlos Buell, although he would deny this after the war, it is reported that he asked, "What preparations have you made for retreating?" With Grant responding, "I have not despaired of whipping them, General." Sherman said that his thought was the only thing just then possible, as it seemed to me, was to put the river between us and the enemy and recuperate, meaning cross over at Pittsburg Landing to that side where the last map showed Nelson. But before he shared that with Grant, he decided to open his conversation with him by saying, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" To which Grant said, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." And Colonel James McPherson, West Point graduate and man that would eventually take over command of this army and be killed leading it in the Battle of Atlanta, but serving as the engineer at Shiloh, approached Grant and said, "Shall I make preparations for a retreat?" Grant, almost astonished by the suggestion, said, "Retreat? No. I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." And so Grant rejects any of the ideas of retreat and, importantly, orders an attack to take the initiative on the second day. The consequence of this, the Union Army gains the initiative. He had actually commented that night that whoever attacked first the second day of the battle was likely to win. So he initiated the attack on the second day, gained a victory at Shiloh, and also it is that kind of attitude of Grant's that led to success on other battlefields and led him to become the general in chief. And when deciding on a title for my book on Shiloh, I thought that that line that he shared with McPherson was the best way of kind of depicting what was most important in this battle. It's the single most important decision made in the Battle of Shiloh. For the epilogue, again, there is going to be fighting on April 7th. I have no key decisions to report for that day other than I think the key things dictating the fight are Beauregard pulling his troops back and Grant deciding to attack as soon as possible. Even though the attack would begin early in the day, the heavy fighting, once Beauregard really brought up his army, would be in the 4 hours from 10 to 2, fighting as intense as on the first day of the battle. But in the end, the Confederates would retreat to Corinth. The Union Army did, again, merge both Grant and Buell's forces on the second day of the battle, and Halleck would come down to take command of them. Grant would fall into criticism for being surprised at Shiloh, and Halleck would make Grant actually his second in command, putting command of Grant's army in George Thomas. As Halleck approached Corinth, the Confederates found the ground, the terrain indefensible, and Beauregard would abandon Corinth without a fight. And with that, those are the key decisions in the Battle of Shiloh.